Imagine being cornered, targeted, and underestimated. Live on air for the world to see. That's exactly what happened to Karoline, but her response was so powerful it left everyone speechless. NBC News, known for interviewing world leaders with its hard-hitting host Robert Dickinson, a man who gives even the most seasoned politicians a tough time. But when it comes to women in politics, his views are just as controversial as today's guest. Enter Karoline, the voice of President Donald Trump. Just 1 month into Trump's presidency, she's already taken on the impossible task of making sense of his policies to a world that sees them as nothing but chaos. And today's interview, it was set to tackle one of the most divisive debates in modern politics, the idea that leadership is best left to men. Leadership debate or not, one thing was certain. Trump had turned it into a global controversy with his views on women in politics, and now it was up to Karoline to put out the fire. As she stepped onto the stage, her signature attire and the prominently displayed cross around her neck made a statement of their own, a symbol of her faith, her conviction, and a silent message to the world. Nothing would shake her beliefs. She had barely taken her seat when Robert struck. Do women truly belong in politics? His words cut through the air, drawing a hush from the audience. The host barely had time to welcome her before Robert pressed further. If leadership demands tough decisions and unshakable resolve, can a woman really handle the weight of power? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The real game had begun. For the first time, Karoline felt the heat. The intensity of Robert's gaze, the weight of the audience's anticipation, it all crashed down on her at once. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she hesitated, fumbling as she reached for the glass of water in front of her. The silence stretched for a second too long. A few whispers rippled through the audience, a couple of raised eyebrows. Robert leaned back slightly, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. He had seen this before, cracks forming, confidence wavering. But then, as the cool water slid down her throat, Karoline took a breath and steadied herself. Get it together. You knew this was coming. He wants you to break. Don't give him that. She straightened in her chair, set the glass down with purpose, and met Robert's gaze head on. It was time to fight back. Karoline took a deep breath, then leaned forward, her confidence now unshakable. Politics is no place for girls. That's not what this is, she said firmly. This is about leadership, about proving that strength and strategy aren't defined by gender. She paused just long enough to let the tension build before striking again. And capability. Her eyes locked onto Robert's. Leadership isn't about biology, Robert. It's about vision, resilience, and the ability to stand firm under pressure. Dismissing women outright is short-sighted. The room stirred. A few in the audience nodded, intrigued. But most remained skeptical, exchanging hushed whispers, their expressions unreadable. They weren't convinced. Not yet. There had to be more. A deeper motive, something unsaid. Robert's smirk faltered for just a second. Karoline had steadied herself. The real battle was only beginning. Robert's smirk hardened as he leaned in, his eyes locked onto Karoline like a predator circling its prey. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He wasn't just asking a question. He was setting a trap. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Karoline, let's not sugarcoat this. His tone was low, but charged, each word deliberate. The truth is, politics is brutal. It's about power plays, unflinching decisions, and the ability to take the hits. If history has favored men, isn't there a reason for that? He let the question linger, giving the audience time to absorb the weight of it before delivering the final blow. If women belong in leadership, why aren't they dominating the field? A hushed murmur spread through the room. The tension crackled. Eyes darted between Robert and Karoline, anticipation hanging thick in the air. The question wasn't just sharp, it was a dare. Would she retreat? Would she falter? For a fraction of a second, Karoline felt the walls closing in, the scrutiny tightening like a noose. But she refused to look away. She knew this was coming. She had prepared for it. This was the moment, and she wasn't going down easy. Karoline exhaled slowly, steadying herself. The weight of 100 stares pressed against her, waiting for a crack, a moment of weakness. She could feel the tension in the room thickening, the cameras zooming in, capturing every flicker of hesitation. She lifted her chin, her voice firm but measured. Context, Robert. A pause, sharp, intentional. History has favored men because men wrote it. Strip away centuries of exclusion, and let's see where we stand. She leaned slightly forward, locking eyes with him. Strength isn't about tradition. It's about breaking it. The air in the studio shifted. Some in the audience nodded, others whispered among themselves. Robert's smirk twitched just slightly. The battle had only just begun. Robert's eyes narrowed. He wasn't letting go. The room tensed as he leaned in, his voice sharp, relentless. Karoline, rhetoric alone doesn't change reality. You say it's about breaking barriers, but leadership isn't about proving a point. It's about commanding respect. If women truly belonged at the top, wouldn't they already be there? His words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. The audience shifted, whispers rippling through the crowd. Robert wasn't asking. He was challenging. And he expected her to stumble. Karoline held her ground, her expression unwavering. She lifted a hand slightly, a controlled, deliberate gesture. The world reacts to perception, Robert. Her tone was steady, unshaken. What they should focus on is competence. Show me one policy, one precedent that proves women are inherently unfit for politics. Silence. A flicker of doubt passed through the audience. Robert shifted, searching for his next attack. Karoline wasn't just defending, she was turning the tide. Robert's jaw tightened, a flicker of frustration crossing his face as he realized he had no concrete evidence to counter her argument. But he wasn't backing down just yet. He leaned in, his voice cutting through the air with renewed sharpness, determined to keep control of the narrative. All right, let's talk about history. When you look at global leadership, the majority of those in power, presidents, prime ministers, kings, have been men. Isn't that just capability proving itself over time? The murmurs in the audience grew louder, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Though Robert was grasping for leverage, he was still holding on to the illusion of control, pushing Karoline into a corner where he believed she would finally stumble. Karoline let a small smirk slip as she recognized that they were finally getting to the core of the discussion, the place where real debates happened, not just headline-driven provocations. That's an old argument, Robert. Power structures aren't proof of superiority. They're proof of tradition, exclusion, and systemic barriers. Leadership isn't about history. It's about who is prepared to shape the future. Robert, sensing an opening, leaned in with sharp intensity. His eyes locked onto Karoline as he pressed forward, his voice carrying the weight of both skepticism and challenge, determined to dismantle her defense piece by piece. If women are just as capable, then why, even in modern times, do they still make up such a small percentage of world leaders? If equality were truly possible, Wouldn't we have already seen a shift? The murmurs in the audience grew louder, a mix of curiosity and unease rippling through the crowd as Robert doubled down, knowing that this was a moment that demanded either a strategic retreat or a masterful counterstrike from Karoline. Karoline tilted her head slightly, the hint of a knowing smirk playing at her lips, as if she had anticipated this exact moment, this precise challenge, long before stepping onto the stage. Her voice was steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who wasn't just answering, but turning the tide. Opportunity isn't the same as outcome, Robert. The barriers women face aren't about skill, they're about access. The real question isn't whether women belong in leadership, it's why, after centuries, people are still afraid to let them prove it. A hush fell over the room. The murmurs that had punctuated the discussion faded into an almost eerie silence, as if the audience itself had been caught off guard by the sheer audacity of her response. A few heads nodded in quiet agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances, still reluctant to accept the shift in momentum. But something was different now. The power in the room had shifted, and for the first time that evening, Robert wasn't the one leading the discussion. Karoline was. The battlefield was no longer policy or governance. Karoline had led the charge elsewhere, forcing Robert into unfamiliar terrain. His poised confidence wavered for a fraction of a second, his carefully curated arguments momentarily slipping from his grasp. The sharp retorts he had wielded like weapons now dulled under the weight of Karoline's unshaken resolve. He blinked, exhaled, shifted in his seat. Small gestures, but enough to betray the shift in power. The audience, once drawn to his relentless questioning, now leaned toward Karoline, waiting, watching. For the first time in the interview, the relentless host wasn't just pausing. He was recalibrating. Robert clenched his jaw, shifting in his seat as the energy in the room turned against him. He could feel it slipping, his control, his influence, his carefully constructed dominance unraveling under Karoline's unwavering poise. The audience had gone from murmuring in uncertainty to openly dismissing him, and, for the first time, Robert found himself scrambling. Forcing a smile, he leaned forward, fingers curling around the chair's armrests. His voice, usually smooth, carried a hard edge beneath its measured tone. "You certainly know how to hold a crowd, Karoline. I'll give you that. But let's not pretend politics is just about who talks the loudest." He tilted his head, his smirk sharpening. History is clear on one thing. Women have never belonged in politics. It's a game of power, of control, of calculated dominance. And that, he said, voice dropping to a condescending whisper, is not a woman's strength. A hush fell over the audience. His words sliced through the air, sharp, deliberate. But beneath his feigned confidence, something raw bled through. An edge of desperation, the realization that he had been backed into a corner. Karoline didn't flinch. The room seemed to shrink, the murmurs fading into a tense silence as Robert's words settled like a slap across the stage. She watched him, the smug tilt of his chin, the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes as if he had just played an unbeatable hand. His voice had dropped to a slow, deliberate cadence, coated in condescension, meant to rattle her. "Oh, don't twist my words, Karoline," he drawled, leaning in slightly, his smirk stretching wider. "What I'm saying is there's a reason power has always been in the hands of men." The audience gasped, the sound sharp and scattered, like air sucked from the room. A few whispered among themselves. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A couple of men in the front row exchanged glances, unsure whether to nod or recoil. The weight of his words had landed, heavy and unmistakable. Karoline let the silence stretch. Let him sit in it. She saw the way his fingers tapped against the table, the way his jaw tensed just slightly as if he was bracing for the storm he had just unleashed. He wanted a reaction. Rage, indignation, maybe even humiliation. But Karoline didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she smiled. Not the polite, camera-ready kind, but something sharper, something dangerous. A knowing smile. The kind that said she had seen this move before. The kind that said he had just made a fatal mistake. The air turned heavy, thick with a charged silence pressing against the walls like an impending storm. Karoline's expression remained composed, but the weight of Robert's words settled over the room like a lead curtain. A murmur rippled through the crowd, gasps punctuating the tension, a few outright boos cutting through the stunned quiet. Robert, unfazed, straightened his posture, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the audience's reaction like a minor inconvenience. His smirk deepened, arrogance gleaming in his eyes. "Let's be real. Women in politics either play the victim or hide behind sentiment," he said. Voice smooth, yet laced with venom. "Tell me, Karoline, when has emotion ever made a leader strong?" Now, the silence wasn't just still, it was suffocating. Some turned their eyes to Karoline, waiting, almost holding their breath. Others stared at Robert, open disgust flickering across their faces. He had said it. The undercurrent of his jabs, the condescension that had simmered beneath his words, now laid bare for all to see. Karoline didn't flinch, didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she let it stretch, let Robert bask in the weight of his own arrogance. The tension in the room thickened, the air charged with anticipation. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she leaned back, crossing her legs, the picture of unshaken control. Her gaze locked onto his, steady and unwavering. "Robert," she said, her voice smooth but edged with steel, "if women don't belong in politics, then why are we always the ones cleaning up after men like you?" The room detonated. Laughter, cheers, applause, waves of it crashing through the space. Robert's smirk wavered, the confidence in his eyes flickering as the energy shifted, the power no longer in his hands. Karoline leaned in, her gaze steady, unshaken by the venom in his words. The room felt tighter, the air charged with an almost electric stillness. "And as for emotion," she said, her voice measured but firm, "it's what keeps leaders human. But true strength? True strength isn't about keeping others down. It's about standing tall against men like you." A ripple went through the crowd. Murmurs, nods, a few sharp exhales. Robert stiffened, his fingers curling against the table, the weight of his own words sinking in. He had played his final hand, thrown his most vicious strike, yet Karoline hadn't just deflected it. She had dismantled it, left him exposed. For the first time he had no clever retort, no smug grin, just silence. A beat passed, heavy and unbroken. The tension in the room didn't fade. It shifted. Robert exhaled sharply, forced a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. He glanced at his notes, searching for something, anything, to regain control. But the moment had slipped. The room wasn't his anymore. Karoline didn't gloat. She simply leaned back, calm, composed, the storm settling within her as the weight of what had just happened settled over the audience. The moderator, sensing the shift, cleared his throat. "I think we'll leave it there." Applause, scattered at first, then stronger. Some still sat in stunned silence, others exchanged murmured words, but the message was clear. The debate was over, and Karoline had won. Robert straightened his papers, masking his defeat behind a thin smile, But as Karoline rose, offering a polite nod before stepping off the stage, he knew, everyone knew, this conversation would be remembered for a long time. If this debate had you on the edge of your seat, the next story will leave an even deeper mark. Click the video on your screen to dive into another gripping tale, one that will challenge perspectives, spark conversation, and stay with you long after it ends. Don't just watch, experience it. Your next journey is just a click away.